Hello, everyone. I'd like to introduce our second to last speaker, Alejandra Rodriguez. Growing up in a bicultural family in Mexico, Alejandra Rodriguez has always been fascinated by comparative cultural studies, especially the growing effects of globalization. She is keenly interested in Latin America and interned over the summer at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Affairs. At Boston College, Ale is a radio DJ for WZBC and served on Pulse Council her sophomore year. She hopes to write a senior thesis on the effects of urbanization on the local population of cities across the world. Her talk tonight is called Mexico, A Culture Trapped in Time. Please join me in welcoming Alejandra Rodriguez.
I think this works. Okay, good. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, ESS, and all of the BCTalks team. You guys really did a ton of work to put this together, and I cannot thank you. So, as Elizabeth mentioned, my name is Alejandra Rodriguez. I was born and raised in Mexico City and came to the US for the first time when I enrolled in BC. Now, my mom's American and my dad's Mexican, so I grew up completely biculturally and bilingually. So I get to see Mexico from a very different perspective, just because I was fortunate enough to have this upbringing. So I'm here to talk to you about Mexico, meanwhile talking about mole. Mole, as you can see here, is one of the most traditional Mexican sauces. It is composed of over 20 different ingredients. I mean, the things that go into this sauce are crazy. It has chocolates, it has chiles, it has onions, garlic, spices, everything. But the point is that mole is used in everything, but it is also made up of many different things. So it is mole as itself, which is incredible, and then also the sum of all of its parts, all of its ingredients. So I'm gonna give you a brief roadmap of how we're gonna go about this, because it might get confusing. So I'll tell you a couple of stories about identity, and then I'll tell you about the history and writings of one of my favorite authors, Octavio Paz, and then I'll give you a brief contemporary context. I'll start you off with a story. My grandparents, who you can see here, came to Boston last May. They fell in love with the city, especially the fact that their umbrella could tip upwards with the wind, and they kind of walked around everywhere like that. So they went to Legal Seafoods, and they thought that it was the best place in the world. So they we went there 3 days in a row, ordered the same thing the 3 times. And essentially my grandmother, who's like tiny and really cute, looked at the dessert menu every single time and saw this like molten lava chocolate cake, you know, like ooey gooey fudgy deliciousness, and kept on going like, chocolate cake. And the waitress or waiter would always write down chocolate cake. And then my grandmother would get up from the table and be like, no, I can't. And the waiter or waitress would obviously look at her very confused, but who can argue with like a 4'9" lady? You just can't. So my grandmother can eat chocolate. Like, she's not allergic, she doesn't have a gluten intolerance, and she's not really concerned about her health. She doesn't eat chocolate to make me healthier. It's confusing, but I'll tell you more. My dad, my grandmother's son, does eat chocolate, but in his like jacket suit or his jeans or whatever, he carries around this tiny coin purse. And this coin purse is full of lucky charms, he calls them. And they're a bunch of trinkets. They're like beetles and bracelets and just anything. The point is, the coin purse doesn't really fit coins because it's so full of these things, but whatever. But among the things that he carries around are these bracelets. And these bracelets are called chinitos, translated to English like little Chinese people. Now, Mexicans are not inherently racist, I promise. We carry around little Chinese people, and I have one here on my wrist because they're inherently lucky. We find the Chinese to be like the people of luck. So we embody them and make them into bracelets and carry them around. So even though these sound as everyday idiosyncrasies, they in reality symbolize so much more. My grandmother's refusal to eat chocolate, which is going on its 18th year, my dad's coin purse, and my chinito are examples of the superstition that makes up the Mexican identity. Referring back to the mole that we saw before, it is one more ingredient in the mole of our identity. As I have witnessed from my own experience, superstition is clearly generational. My mom, who's American, does eat chocolate, doesn't have a coin purse full of trinkets, and doesn't wear bracelets around her wrist. So it never came together to me until I read Octavio Paz. Paz writes that the Mexican culture, among other things, is a culture made up of unfulfilled identities. So I'll give you a brief history. Among of the many different native cultures that inhabited Mexico at the time, the Mexicas, or Aztecs, were one of the most developed. At the climax of their development, Hernán Cortés arrives in Cuba, gets to the coast, over in Veracruz, and makes his way into the heart of Mexico, armed with another native tribe of the Tlaxcalans. He befriends the Tlaxcalans, who were enemies of the Aztecs of the time, marches towards Mexico City, the capital, or Tenochtitlan, and essentially, when Moctezuma gets there, he sees Hernán Cortés in shining armor, on top of a horse, with the sword. He's like, oh, he's a god. So Moctezuma befriends Cortés and invites him into his palace. Essentially, Cortés, after a couple of days, goes on a murderous rampage, kills everyone, and whoever wasn't killed was enslaved by the Spanish. Thus ends one of the periods in Mexican history. It's the fall of the Aztec Empire. With that is the establishment of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. Essentially, that's a picture of what used to be Mexico, and yes, to this day, we believe that we are entitled to California, New Mexico, etc. But the point is that we have a viceroyalty established with a viceroy who's a representative of the King of Spain in Mexico. This period lasts almost 300 years, until the move for independence in 1810. In 1810, Miguel Hidalgo, who's pictured here, among others, galvanized towards the fight for independence. The battle for independence was long and bloody and lasted 11 years, until finally we gained independence in 1821. Most importantly is all Mexicans, or what were New Spaniards, united for this one common goal, and it symbolized the end of another period, the fall of another empire, the Spanish Empire. Unfortunately, Mexicans aren't as efficient as the US, and we didn't get it right the first time, and we didn't go straight into a democracy. So we first had an emperor, and then we had a dictator, and then we had a president, but then we had an emperor again, and then we had another dictator. So in 1910, finally comes the revolution. With the revolution comes a democracy, finally. So what ends up happening is that Octavio Paz calls this period in history the modern period of Mexico, beginning with the revolution. The Labyrinth of Solitude, which is one of Paz's landmark works, is written in 1950. So Paz was reflecting on 40 years prior. Our problem is we find ourselves in 2012, with 62 years of history and of lived experience that have elapsed since Paz wrote his book. So here's where I come in. I'm identifying a fourth period in Mexican history, the fourth fall of an empire. I'm going to call it double-faced modernity. Beginning in 1940, Mexico saw itself with a huge growth in the economy. It was almost a 5% increase annually. The growth gave birth to two trends: an increased Americanization, where we were able to enjoy a lot of the goods that the US was producing, televisions, cars, etc., but it also gave rise to a new upper class, a new bourgeoisie. So it essentially factioned the lower class and the upper class, leaving very little room for middle class. This period was also characterized by huge corruption in politics. What ended up happening is that there were a consecutive series of 5 presidents who were puppets under one mastermind behind everything. He was the shadow president. And of course, this creates a very faulty system. Faulty economy with maximum importation and very little exportation. A puppeteer president who's orchestrating all of the government. And culturally, we're kind of, something. So it all started in 1968 with student protests. Students took to the streets of Mexico and protested the faulty economy, the corruption in the government, and the repressive system. They organized a massive protest in a plaza in a part of the city called Tlatelolco. There, all of the students gathered and essentially peacefully protested. What ended up happening is that they were protesting in a plaza. So the military took their tanks, blocked off the exits, infiltrated the buildings surrounding, and shot down point blank. Nobody had nowhere to go. They were enclosed, and essentially hundreds of students were killed. Well, it was a huge government cover-up. 10 days later, Mexico hosts the Olympics. For the first time in our history, we get the Olympics. Thousands of international spectators flock the streets of Mexico City 10 days after this happened. Government buries all of the bodies in a mass grave. Nobody knows how many were actually killed. And then we get the Olympics where people are flocking the same streets where people are killed. So thus comes crashing another empire. So where does that leave us today? Here is a picture of Tlatelolco. Tlatelolco, and this is a specific part where the students protested, it's called the Plaza de las Tres Culturas, or Plaza of Three Cultures. It is the embodiment of the three periods that Bas talks about. You have the pyramids, which are pictured below, the colonial church, and then the modern buildings in the back. I want to add that it's not the Plaza of the Three Cultures, it's the Plaza of the Four Cultures. There are ghosts that haunt this plaza, and these are the ghosts of the students that were murdered here, and then it was covered up by the government. So where does that leave us? It still doesn't answer the question as to why we refuse to eat chocolate, or why we wear bracelets around our wrists, or why we carry around coin purses full of trinkets. Fact of the matter is, the object itself is not the superstition. The objects are completely arbitrary. The luck and the superstition comes from the person. The person creates the symbol and creates the superstition in it. So if I consider my sweater to be lucky, it will be lucky for the rest of my life. And suddenly my sweater is my lucky charm. We are superstitious because it's part of our identity and we have reason to be. It's an ingredient in the mole. The fact of the matter is that today we are faced with so many problems: the drug wars, the economic problems, corruption in politics, and the most important problem is that culturally we're faced with competing identities. We don't know really who we are because we are a culture trapped in time. We're a culture trapped with unfulfilled identities. We face fragility in ourselves, in our people, and in our culture. And that is why we are superstitious. Thank you.